When I married Anthony, I knew there'd be gaps, age, interests, pace of life, things we navigated carefully, like stepping stones over shallow water. He was 52 when I met him, stable, calm, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice or his pulse for anything. I was 29, with a marketing job that stressed me out and made me crave the safety his world promised. He made everything seem easier. He gave me space to rest. Thought that was love. We got married quickly, 9 months from first date, to vows. His son, Jacob, didn't attend the wedding. I didn't ask why. Anthony said they had a strained relationship, and I didn't push. I wasn't eager to be anyone's stepmom, least of all to a 20-year-old who clearly wanted nothing to do with me. But then his mother fell sick. Suddenly, aggressively, stage 4 cancer doesn't ask for permission. We had to drive upstate 8 hours. Jacob flew in from college to come with us. It would be the first time I met him. He stepped out of the terminal and walked straight past me. He hugged his dad, nodded in my direction without making eye contact. His jaw was tight posture too straight, dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and athletic, frame in a hoodie and jeans. He looked nothing like Anthony, except in the way his eyes scanned the world like it owed him something. I tried to be polite. I asked about his semester. He gave one-word answers. No warmth. It was like I wasn't even there. We reached the rental car kiosk, and of course, there was a mistake. They'd given away the SUV we booked, only a small sedan left. We could have taken a separate car. But Anthony insisted we stay together. It was cramped. Anthony had back problems and couldn't sit in the back. I didn't want to either, but it was what it was. Jacob shrugged. "She can sit on my lap," he said dryly, like it wasn't insane. My stomach tightened, but Anthony laughed and said, "Just until the next rest stop, we got." And Jacob slid behind the passenger seat. I climbed in after him. I could feel his breath on my neck before I even settled. His hand brushed my thigh as he adjusted. I stiffened. I wasn't used to being this close to anyone who wasn't my husband. My back was pressed to his chest. His arm rested behind me, palm flat against the door. I tried to lean forward to create space, but the car was too small. I could feel his heartbeat. Or maybe it was mine. I kept my eyes on the road ahead. The silence was unbearable. Anthony made small talk about the route, the hospital traffic. I mumbled responses. Jacob said nothing, but I could feel his fingers twitching near my waist, not touching. Not quite. 15 minutes passed, then 30. No rest stop. I shifted slightly, and he let out a breath through his nose. Was he annoyed, or was that a laugh? "You okay back there?" Anthony asked, glancing in the mirror. "Yeah," I said quickly. Jacob didn't say a word. An hour in my legs was starting to go numb. I moved again, trying to readjust, and I felt it. His hand briefly barely against my hip. Not firm, just enough to remind me where I was, who I was sitting on. I said nothing. Neither did he. We stopped for gas. I jumped out quickly, needing space. In the bathroom mirror, I didn't recognize myself. Flushed cheeks, white eyes. This wasn't a crush. It wasn't even curiosity. It was just discomfort, I told myself. Pure, awkward discomfort. Back in the car, I sat in the back again. Jacob didn't look at me. This time I didn't shift. I stayed rigid, focused on the road, the green blur of trees whipping by, the voice of Anthony, filling the silence. I nodded when I had to try to act normal. 3 hours left. Somewhere near Albany, I dozed off. I woke up to the feeling of movement. Jacob adjusting again. His hand grazing my waist, quickly retreating. My pulse jumped. I sat upright, pretending I hadn't noticed. He still hadn't said a single word to me. When we finally reached the hospital, I got out of the car and didn't look back. I walked straight inside. Grateful for the sterile air, the distant beeping of machines, anything to distract me. I tried to reset my brain. The visit was hard. Anthony's ex-wife didn't recognize anyone. She drifted in and out, her voice a whisper. Jacob barely spoke. He stood by her bed like a statue. Anthony rubbed his shoulders once and Jacob flinched. We left late. No hotel had a room with 2 beds left. Anthony, exhausted, claimed the single room we'd booked. Jacob was willing to sleep on the pull-out couch in the hotel lobby, but the manager offered a second room last minute. Only 1 bed. Anthony said, "Let them take it. They're younger." Protested. "I can sleep on the floor." "No," Jacob said simply. "It's fine to sleep. I won't even be on the bed." That night we didn't speak. He took one edge, took the other. Our backs were turned, but I didn't sleep. I listened to the fan. I felt the warmth of his body behind me, even with distance. I remembered the car, his breathing, his hand. How still he'd stayed. How still I had stayed. I told myself I wasn't thinking about it, but I was, because I remembered too much for someone who claimed it didn't matter. I remembered the pressure of his thigh under mine, the shift of his chest as I leaned forward, the brush of air across my shoulder when he sighed. And in the morning when we got up and packed and said nothing about anything, I wondered if he'd thought about it too, or if he already knew that I had. We didn't speak much on the drive back. Anthony talked most of the way, filling the silence with updates from work, family, irrelevant memories that none of us had asked for. Jacob didn't respond to most of it. I stayed quiet. My body ached from tension, but I pretended to sleep to avoid conversation, even though my thoughts were louder than anything in the car. The space between Jacob and me was wider now, yet the awareness was sharper. Every time his knee shifted, every time he adjusted his arm or reached for water, I felt it. Like I'd memorized his proximity and now couldn't unlearn it. His scent was still in my head. Not cologne, something warm, slightly musky like sweat and clean fabric. It hit me in waves, uninvited and unwelcome. Back at home, everything should have returned to normal. Anthony went straight back to work. Long days, late nights, conference calls at odd hours. He was always tired. I understood, or at least told myself I did. But the silence in the house grew deeper. Jacob stayed with us for the week. His college break extended. I didn't question why. Anthony was glad to have him around. I was too. And I hated that I was. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and Jacob was already there, drinking orange juice, straight from the bottle. I frowned and said something about hygiene. He raised an eyebrow and said, "You were practically on top of me for 8 hours. Bit late to worry about germs now." Froze. He smirked and walked out. He didn't say it to flirt. It wasn't gentle. It was a jab, sharp and deliberate. But the implications stuck. He hadn't forgotten, and neither had I. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I went to the living room to read. He was there, scrolling on his phone, earbuds in. I almost turned around, but he looked up. We didn't speak. I sat down on the opposite end of the couch. I pretended to read. He kept scrolling. Minutes passed. He took out one earbud and asked, "Why did you marry him?" I didn't answer right away, because he made me feel safe. He nodded. "That's not love." I never said it was. I replied sharper than I meant. He stared at me for a second longer than necessary. Then he put the earbud back in and turned away. But the question stayed. Why had I married Anthony? Because he was stable. Because he didn't challenge me. Because I was tired of dating men who disappeared the second things got hard. The next day, Anthony left early for a business meeting. I made coffee in silence. Jacob walked in, shirtless, fresh out of the shower. He didn't cover himself, didn't apologize. He just poured himself a mug and leaned against the counter. You don't talk much, he said. Neither do you. He smiled faintly. Maybe we're similar. I shook my head. We're not. He took a sip, eyes on me over the rim of his cup. You sure about that? I turned away, pretending to clean a spotless countertop. Don't do that. Do what? Whatever this is. I'm just standing here. But he wasn't. Every word was calculated. He wasn't touching me, but it felt like he was. I left the room. The more I avoided him, the more present he became. Small things. Sitting closer than necessary on the couch, holding eye contact too long, brushing past me in narrow hallways. Nothing I could accuse him of, nothing I could define. But everything he did felt deliberate. One evening we ended up watching a movie together. Anthony was still at work. I didn't want to stay, but leaving would have felt like admitting something. Halfway through, a quiet scene played. No dialogue, just music. I felt Jacob's eyes on me. I looked back. For once there was no smirk, no sarcasm, just stillness. He reached out slowly, brushing a piece of lint off my sleeve. His fingers lingered a moment too long. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I felt heat rise in my chest, spreading like a warning. But I didn't stop him. I know what you're doing, I said finally. I'm not doing anything, he replied, voice low. That's the problem. He leaned in slightly. You don't want me to stop. It wasn't a question. I stood up and walked out, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Upstairs, I closed the door to our bedroom and locked it like that would solve anything. I couldn't. Erase the electricity still buzzing under my skin. That night, I dreamed of him. Not in a romantic way. In a way that unsettled me. I dreamed of being in the car again, of sitting on his lap. But this time, his arms were around me. I woke up flushed, disgusted, and confused. For days, I tried to recalibrate. I busied myself with errands, with work, with chores I had ignored. Jacob didn't approach me again. He gave me space, maybe sensing the edge I was standing on. But that restraint only made things worse. It made me want to know what would happen if he didn't hold back. Then came the storm. Anthony called, saying he'd be stuck at the hotel overnight. A client dinner had turned into drinks and the roads were bad. I said, okay, trying to ignore the flicker of something unnameable in my chest. Jacob and I were alone. We barely spoke during dinner. He cleared his plate. I stayed at the table, scrolling through my phone, pretending to read the same sentence 10 times. As I got up to leave, he said my name. Just once. Steady, turn. He didn't move closer. He didn't reach for me. He just looked at me like he had already seen every part of me and knew I wouldn't walk away. Did, though. I went upstairs, closed the door, and sat on the floor. But all I could think about was how close I had come to doing something irreversible. How much of me already wanted to. The next morning, everything felt louder. The clinking of dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, even my own breathing. I couldn't meet Jacob's eyes, not because of anything that had happened, but because of everything. That almost had. He didn't seem fazed. He moved through the kitchen like nothing had changed, like we weren't balancing on a razor's edge. Anthony returned in the afternoon. He kissed my cheek, told me about the storm, the clients, the boring hotel food. I nodded, responded when needed, but part of me wasn't there. Part of me was still replaying the moment Jacob said my name, the weight it carried, the silence that followed. Over the next few days, Jacob kept his distance. Not cold, just careful. He stopped lingering in rooms, stopped brushing past me. It should have made things easier, but it didn't. It only confirmed that he knew exactly what he was doing before and what I'd allowed. On the 4th day, Anthony left for work early. I was home alone, reading on the couch when Jacob came downstairs, bags packed. His break was over. I should have felt relief. Instead, my stomach sank. "You're leaving?" asked, keeping my tone casual. He nodded. "Back to campus. Flights in 2 hours." I swallowed. "Safe travels." He walked to the door, paused, then turned. "You never answered my question." I blinked. "What question?" "Why you're still here. I told you. He's safe." "Yeah, you did. But that's not a reason anymore." "That's an excuse." I didn't respond. He held my gaze, then walked out. I didn't tell Anthony about the conversation. Couldn't. It would have forced me to admit things I hadn't even admitted to myself yet. But I thought about it constantly. The way Jacob said, "Still here," as if I'd been waiting for something else all along. The days stretched on. I went through motions, work, laundry, dinner. I laughed when appropriate, made plans I didn't care about. But I was haunted by what hadn't happened. The absence of a mistake was not the same as innocence. I knew that now. Then one night, a week later, Jacob texted me. I didn't say goodbye properly. I stared at the message for too long before responding. "You did." He replied immediately. "No, I wanted to tell you something. I didn't ask what. I didn't need to." A minute later, he sent another. "I think about you more than I should." Put the phone down. Walked away. Poured a glass of water just to have something to hold. When I came back, the screen had lit up again. "You think about me, too." Don't lie. I deleted the conversation. Not because I disagreed, but because I didn't want proof of my silence. Still, I couldn't stop imagining what I'd say if I had answered. I'd tell him he was wrong, that this wasn't real, that he was just bored, rebellious, playing a dangerous game. But part of me didn't believe any of that. Part of me had memorized the exact feeling of his breath near my ear, the way his voice lowered when we were alone. The next few weeks were a slow unraveling. Anthony grew busier. He started staying out. Later working weekends. I stopped asking questions. We shared meals, but not moments. Our conversations were practical. We lived like polite roommates. And Jacob kept texting. Not every day. Just enough to remind me he existed. Enough to make me wonder what I'd do if I ever saw him again. Then, out of nowhere, Anthony told me we'd be visiting his sister for the weekend. Family event. I assumed Jacob wouldn't be there. He wasn't close with them, but when we arrived, he was. Sitting on the porch like he'd been waiting for me. He didn't acknowledge me right away. Just gave his dad a brief hug. Then disappeared inside. My key. Heart raced with every step I took. I wasn't ready. I hadn't prepared for this. I thought I'd never have to. Dinner was crowded and loud. I sat at the far end of the table opposite Jacob. He didn't look at me once. He spoke to everyone but me. Laughed at jokes, passed dishes, acted completely indifferent. Should have calmed me. Instead, I felt invisible. Not rejected, punished. Afterward, people drifted into the living room. I slipped into the kitchen to breathe. Few seconds later, Jacob followed. He didn't speak, just stood near the sink watching me. I didn't turn to face him. I said, "This can't happen." He stepped closer. It already did. "No," I said quickly. "It didn't." We stopped it. He tilted his head. "Did we? Or did you just need it to stay unfinished so you wouldn't feel guilty?" I bit my lip hard enough to hurt. "You don't know anything about guilt." "I know it keeps you up at night," he said. "I know you haven't told him. I know you won't." I finally turned. To him. And what would telling him solve? Nothing. But lying won't either. We stood there, close, the air thick with everything unspoken. Then footsteps echoed from the hall and he backed away. Just like that, the moment was gone. but not erased. Later that night, he walked past me in the hallway. Our eyes met for a second. Nothing more. But that second stayed with me longer than it should have. When we got home, I tried to forget all of it. I threw myself into work, into chores, into meaningless distractions. But the distance between Anthony and me widened until it was a chasm. Didn't reach for him. He didn't notice. And Jacob, he stopped texting. No warning, no explanation, just silence. I thought it would help. I thought I'd feel lighter. But instead, it felt like a door had slammed shut before I'd even decided whether to walk through it. And all I could think was, if silence is supposed to feel like peace, why did it feel like punishment? 3 months passed. Jacob didn't message again. I didn't reach out either. But every day I checked my phone a little too often, as if expecting his name to appear. Never did. Life returned to normal on the surface, routine, stable, quiet. But it felt fake, like we were all playing roles we no longer believed in. Anthony. And I barely touched. The space between us wasn't filled with anger or betrayal, just indifference. He assumed I was tired, overworked, distracted. He didn't question the way I avoided intimacy. He didn't ask why I stayed out longer after errands or stared off during dinner. And I didn't offer anything. Silence had become our safety net. Then one evening, Anthony received a call. His ex-wife had passed away. Jacob had been there, arranged everything, didn't ask for help. Anthony was shaken. Emotional in a way I hadn't seen before. He booked a flight for the funeral. I assumed he would go alone. But he turned to me that night and said, "I want you with me." I agreed, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't have the courage to say no. We flew in the next morning. The funeral was small, somber, with more silence than grief. Jacob stood apart from everyone. He didn't glance at me once. He didn't speak to his father. He just stood, arms folded, staring at the ground like it held answers. After the service, I stepped outside to breathe. A few minutes later, Jacob followed. He stood beside me, not looking at me, hands in his pockets. "I didn't invite you," he said flatly. "I didn't come for you." He nodded once, then said, "But you came." I didn't reply. He continued, "You don't have to pretend anymore. I know what you want." I knew then, too. "I didn't do anything," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. "No, but you wanted to." And that's worse sometimes. We stood there, the air between us heavier than it had ever been. "I thought if I cut you off, you'd forget," he said. "I thought I'd forget, but I haven't." "That's not fair," I whispered. "None of this is fair," he said. "You made your choice. So why does it feel like you're still waiting for something?" Had no answer. That night, back at the hotel, Anthony fell asleep early. I lay beside him wide awake. I thought about every choice I hadn't made, every line I hadn't crossed, and whether that still made me a good person. Because I had wanted to. I still did. And wanting felt like betrayal, even if I had never acted on it. I got up and walked to the balcony. The city lights flickered in the distance. The wind was cold. I wasn't thinking clearly, or maybe I was for the first time. I sent Jacob a single message. "Where are you?" No response. I waited 10 minutes, then 20. My pulse was loud in my ears. I started to regret it when my phone vibrated. "Room 304. I stared at the screen, then I turned it off and walked back inside. But I didn't sleep. I lay in bed beside my husband, listening to his breathing, wondering if this was what marriage was supposed to feel like. Safe, quiet, numb. I kept telling myself that safety should be enough, that stability mattered, that desire fades and comfort is what lasts. But the truth was, I felt empty, like I had pressed pause on my own life and forgotten why. In the morning, we flew home. Anthony seemed lighter. relieved that the chapter with his ex-wife had closed. He talked about maybe visiting Jacob more, trying to reconnect. I nodded, unsure how to respond. The idea of seeing Jacob again made my stomach knot. Weeks passed. Life resumed. But something had shifted. I started waking up earlier, eating less, moving through the house like a guest. One night, Anthony sat beside me on the couch and said, "Are we okay?" I wanted to lie. I wanted to say yes and make it all go away. But I couldn't. "I don't know," I said. He nodded slowly. "Did something happen?" I hesitated. "No, nothing happened." "Then why do you look like you're somewhere else all the time?" "'Cause I was." I didn't say it, but I knew he saw it in my silence, in the way I barely touched him, in how I never met his eyes when he asked real questions. I didn't tell him about Jacob. I didn't confess the texts, the tension, the thoughts I had tried to bury. Because it wasn't about Jacob, not really. It was about me, about the parts of myself I had silenced for years in exchange for comfort. I started therapy. Lone. I didn't tell Anthony at first. I wanted answers that didn't rely on anyone else's presence. I needed to figure out why I had been so drawn to something forbidden, why I had stood on the edge of a decision that could have destroyed everything and still felt tempted. In therapy, I learned something painful. Emotional infidelity begins with the absence of honesty with others and with yourself, and I had been dishonest. Not in action, but in intention. I had flirted with boundaries, entertained possibility, withheld truths that mattered. I still hadn't touched Jacob. But I had wanted him more than I'd ever wanted anything. That was a betrayal. One day, weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name and handwriting I recognized. Inside was a single sentence. "You were the first person who ever made me feel seen, and that's why I had to let you go." I didn't cry. I just sat there holding the paper, feeling everything at once. I burned the letter that night. Not out of anger, but to let it go. Months later, Anthony and I separated. Quietly. No fights, no screaming, just mutual exhaustion. He moved out. I stayed. I told him I was sorry. Not for cheating because I hadn't, but for hiding how lonely I had been. And now I'm alone. I haven't heard from Jacob since, and maybe I never will. But I carry him with me. Not as a regret, but as a reminder of what happens when you lie to yourself long enough that truth starts to feel like temptation. Some stories don't end in flames. Some just fade and leave you watching the smoke, wondering what might have happened if you'd made one different choice.